I'm so curious, are there legitimate, like modern examples of people who have survived in a whale?
There was a lobster fisherman off the coast of Cape Cod who was diving, and he was actually fully swallowed by a humpback whale, was entirely within the mouth of the whale. He reports that it was dark. He was fully enclosed. Once the boat was on the bottom of the ocean, he had no way to get out of the room for 3 days before he was rescued. Yes, the story tells us very powerfully that God is faithful to his promises, and he will accomplish his promises regardless of whatever obstacles may exist in our lives on earth. And he accomplishes his purposes in history and also in our individual lives.
Could Jonah have really survived 3 days in the belly of the whale or the big fish? Critics have often claimed that it is scientifically impossible. The story is a myth, and thus the Bible is unreliable. Here to offer a different perspective is Dr. William Cheshire, a professor of neurology. He holds an AB in biochemical sciences from Princeton University, an MD from West Virginia University, and is pursuing his MA in science and religion at Talbot School of Theology, which is a sister program to our apologetics degree. He's written an article in the Christian Research Journal about this, and the moment I read it, I thought, we've got to have him on. So, Dr. Cheshire, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure, Sean. Thank you so much for inviting me. You say they're critics, and the fact that there are critics to things that are stated in the Bible is one piece of evidence that these are important questions that matter. So they're worth discussing.
Well said. I love that. Now, as a medical doctor and a professor of neurology, there's a lot of issues you could write and research. Why are you interested in this topic?
Well, yes, and I have written on topics in ethics and the autonomic nervous system, which is my field. I became interested in this because I'm interested in the intersection of science and Christian faith. And for a long time, there's been this myth that science and faith are at odds with each other, and there's a warfare between science and faith, and we have to choose one side or the other. I think that's mistaken. In fact, if we go back to the history of science, we find that many of the great scientists in 16th, 17th century Europe that founded the discipline of the scientific method that we know now, Isaac Newton, Galileo, Boyle, Faraday, many others, were devout Christians. So you don't have to be an atheist to be a scientist for it to make sense. In fact, these early scientists were confident that because God is rational and orderly and keeps his promises, that therefore his creation must be that way also. And that gave them the confidence to know that they could investigate it and also to understand it to some degree. So we had this connection between science and faith. The story of Jonah is just one example where it hasn't been fully reconciled yet. So I saw an opportunity to learn something.
Well, I appreciate that. You're not claiming to like fully reconcile and answer this. You're just kind of probing in, saying, is there a scientific way to look at this? Is this anti-science? And you offer some really interesting insights that we will come into. Now, there's one question broadly, the way you framed it is like science against faith. But then when it comes to Jonah and the whale, we're often told that stories like this are clearly mythical and in particular have been debunked by science. In your estimation, is that true?
Well, the idea that anything not entirely explained by science is therefore been debunked is greatly exaggerated. There are many things that we know apart from scientific investigation. We have to be careful not to fall into the fallacy of scientism as distinguished from science. Scientism is a philosophy or a metaphysical position that says that the only thing that we can know about reality is what we can know through the exact sciences. But there are other ways of knowing as well. If we follow this road of scientism down its logical pathway, you might agree with Francis Crick. He was the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, and he wrote a book where he claimed that all of us are nothing more than the molecules that make up our bodies. Our brains are nothing more than neurons. We're entirely physical stuff and nothing more. I think there's much more to human nature than that. And not all of it is immediately accessible to the scientific method, which investigates physical aspects of reality and looks for natural causes in phenomena that are repeatable, that can be investigated, quantified, where hypotheses can be tested, and so forth. But there are other ways of learning about reality as well that I think if we look at truth overall, we might find are complementary to our scientific understanding of things.
Mm. That's a really helpful way to look at it. Science is not the only way we know things. There's a lot of things we know from testimony, from experience. There's things we know immediately, like moral knowledge, but it's one powerful way of knowing things about the world. That's for sure. So I think that's a really helpful way that you frame this. I'd be really curious as you scientifically went into this story of Jonah, like what did you expect to find? And how did you kind of bracket, like, okay, I'm a Christian, and so I have certain convictions, but I've got to follow where the science leads?
I came into this project not expecting any particular outcome.
Mm,
If I were to find that scientifically is totally impossible, that would not shake my faith at all, um, because there's always the possibility for miracles. God can do whatever he wants with his creation. But
mm,
can we understand this story better by looking at the science? Now, if we look at whales, and I think that the big fish in the story of Jonah, Dag Gadol in the Hebrew, which translates fish, but they didn't distinguish fish from whales
mm,
in ancient times. Whales actually are mammals, but they wouldn't have known that. I think if we look at what we know about whales now, there's a lot that we can add to the story. And the reason there's been a lot of scientific research into whales in the last couple of decades is that they've become an endangered species. In the 18th and 19th century, they were exploited commercially, hunted down, and many species of whales were brought to the brink of extinction
mm,
because whales were sold for their blubber, which could make oil and soap and useful products. But it got out of hand, and whales are actually very important on planet Earth. For those who are interested in climate change, whales play a role in the carbon dioxide cycle on planet Earth. They
mm,
eat small fish and krill, and the wastes of the whale, as they're going through the oceans, is the food for plankton. Plankton is one of the major uh, uh, chlorophyll um, forms of life on planet Earth that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We want less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in order to slow down global warming. So the fact that the number of whales has decreased over time might be a factor in climate change. I've not investigated that. I just want to point out that they're part of God's creation. They're important. They're not just sort of incidental life forms out there.
good.
So there's been a lot of research in whales. So I wanted to know, well, what has been learned about whales in the last few decades that might add something to what we can understand about the story of Jonah?
That's so interesting and fascinating. And when I was in Israel, this is, I think it's 2019. I was thinking of the story of David, roughly 3,000 years ago, and it talks about a bear and a lion that he killed. And yet there's no bears and lions in Israel. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, scientifically, this is a problem. I talked with my Jewish guide and he goes, yeah, they're not here anymore, but there's remains of bears and lions from that time. So the story's plausible. I thought, how interesting. So it's the same thing with you. I've been to the Mediterranean Sea. I've been to Joppa. I've been to the area where they believe the story took place and always wondered, like, are there actually big fish? Like, what kind of fish was this? Could somebody really have actually survived in a big fish or a whale for a period of time? Always been in the back of my mind. Now, we're going to get to your scientific assessment of this, but maybe just remind us, most people know, what is the broad outlines of the story of Jonah?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your recommendation for my next research project of lions in Israel. Uh,
Good. Do it.
I wonder how thoroughly that's been looked at. It would be nice to have an excuse to go back over there. And I hope that we will see more peace in that land. It's been very troubled.
Mm,
Um, and speaking of Israel, I came face to face with a whale in Israel. So not everyone knows that dolphins are classified as whales. I was scuba diving in the Red Sea in 1998, came face to face with the dolphin, swam right up to me, and
Interesting.
they are whales. Um, but I didn't know before, my wife didn't know, the most common type of whale in the Mediterranean, there are whales in the Mediterranean other than dolphins, are the fin whales. And they are a very common type of whale worldwide. I think that's the species that probably Jonah interacted with.
Mm.
So who was Jonah? Jonah was a Jew who lived in the 8th century BC. And the word of the Lord came to Jonah, we are told in the book of Jonah. And the word of the Lord was, Jonah, get up and go to Nineveh and preach against them because they have done evil. So what did Jonah do? Did Jonah say, here am I, Lord, send me? How quickly can I get there? No, no. Jonah said, I don't want any part of this. I want to get as far away from this as I can. So he boarded a ship for Tarshish. Tarshish, it's not known for certain where it was, but scholars think it was on the southern coast of Spain, what modern Spain, near Gibraltar. The distance between Tarshish and Nineveh was about 2,500 miles, which is about the distance between you and me right now,
Oh,
talking between Florida and California.
okay.
So he wanted to get far away, and he tells us later in the book of Jonah why, and that is Jonah didn't like the Assyrians in Nineveh. Nineveh was the major city of the empire of Assyria. It was very prominent, very important culturally. They worshipped the god Ishtar in Nineveh, which displeased God. But Jonah didn't like them. They were a threat to Israel, and at times they were Israel's enemy. So he didn't want to go preach a message to them. So he boarded a ship, and he's sailing west on his way to Tarshish, getting out of the way of trouble. Right? He just wants a peaceful life, perhaps. But then a storm came up. There were strong winds, and the ship was in danger of breaking up and going under. And the mariners on board, who are not Jews, uh, decided, well, there must be someone on board who's angered the gods and is causing this trouble for us. Who could it be? They threw lots, and the lot came to Jonah. They approached Jonah, who was asleep down below, and Jonah confessed, yes, it's because of me and my God, and if you were to throw me overboard, the storm would cease. So Jonah is owning up at this point and putting his life at risk. An interesting point as I reread the book in preparation for our interview today, these mariners on board are not Jews, and they threw Jonah overboard, but right before they did that, they prayed to Jonah's God to spare Jonah's life. So
Interesting.
here we have non-Jews praying to God to
Huh.
save Jonah's life, and God answered their prayer because we learn later that Jonah was saved from the whale. And that's just part of the message of the book, that God cares about people outside of the covenant that he created with the Jews. And this is Jonah's disagreement with God. God, why are you so merciful to the Assyrians? I hate them. And so this is part of the message, that God's grace, his love, is beyond
Mm.
what Jonah had imagined. That's a message for all of us. So Jonah is thrown overboard. And then we're told that God sent a big fish, a whale, I think, who swallowed Jonah, and Jonah remained in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah then prays a prayer to the Lord God and talks about his experience in the belly, how the waters were rushing over him and the weeds were wrapped around his neck. And then he says, salvation is from the Lord. And then at that moment, he is saved. The whale expels Jonah on the shore, and Jonah ends up going to Nineveh and preaching against them. And the Ninevites repent, and God does not judge them. He
Mm.
shows his mercy, which is greater than his wrath.
Mm.
It's a fascinating book. And we might ask, well, is it just a fairy tale? Is it a children's story? It works as a children's story, right? Because the Bible is meaningful to people at all stages in life. But I think it's more than that. As a critic, we might say, well, what genre are we dealing with? Is this poetry? There is a poetic prayer in the book. Is it prophecy or is it history? And so I'm asking the question, well, can the science of what we know about whales help us to answer that question? Could this be an historical narrative?
Mm.
As I read the book, it comes across as a historical narrative. There's a lot of detail about who was involved, where they were in the situation. Jonah is named, his father is named. We have 3 cities that are named, and it reads like a story placed in history rather than something in a made-up land. So I think at face value, it comes across as historical.
Mm. What you said at the beginning of the answer, I think, is really important, that even if this is scientifically impossible and you're not able to offer a plausible way where somebody could survive in a whale for 3 days, it wouldn't prove that this is false. In one sense, we can't explain all of this scientifically. There's a certain level of timing when Jonah's thrown overboard and protected by this whale and swallowed by it. This isn't accident. There's a level of God's design being there. After 3 days, spits him up on the shore. So even if we can't explain all this scientifically, anybody reading it realizes the hand of God is at play, at least in some level. So if it's scientifically impossible to stay inside of a whale, that doesn't mean this is false. It would mean that this is a miracle and God is preserving him. Now, we don't have to answer this right now, but in some ways, sometimes when people ask me about Jonah, I say, look, if there's a God who's eternal and self-existent, creates something from nothing, life from non-life, gives us breath, clearly this God has the power to keep Jonah alive for 3 days if that God exists. So in some ways, scientific or not, doesn't disprove it. But I think what we're going to get to with your response is really interesting. I've wondered about this since I was a kid. But let me ask you this question. I'm assuming people like Dawkins and Bart Ehrman skeptics, do they just completely say this is mythological, completely dismiss this and use this to undermine the biblical narrative? Or is there anything else in their critiques that you think are worth bringing up before we respond?
Well, I looked to see what these gentlemen have said about the story of Jonah and other miracles in the Old Testament. And Richard Dawkins is amusing to read. And he
Agreed.
says the story is just silly, right?
Huh.
It's just nonsense. But I'm not convinced that he's right. Bart Ehrman calls it just a story. He had a blog post about Jonah that I found online, and I wanted to see what Bart thought because he's actually an old friend of mine.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. When he was in seminary, we were in a small group together. He and his wife and my wife and a couple of other couples. We spent a lot of time with him.
Huh.
He's brilliant.
That's right.
He and I have gone in different directions theologically. But I admire his intellect, and I'm saddened by some of the positions he's taken theologically. So I want to counter what each of those gentlemen, admirable gentlemen, nevertheless, what each of them had to say, because I think there's more to the story.
Fair enough. With Dawkins, it's interesting. I've never met him. From his worldview, it makes sense that this story would be silly if you have a materialistic, naturalistic worldview. But there also could be a sense if it's not true, but respect the literature and the history of it rather than write it off as silly. So I think in many ways, the way people approach this story is indicative of their worldview, Christian or not. And that brings us to my next question. I've never studied the history of how thinkers in the past or in the present approach this. When I saw your article, I started to think, is there a history of taking this as mythological? Or has it always been taken historically? Or has there always been a debate about this? Maybe just tell us, I'm assuming you haven't done like a deep historical dive on this. And by the way, if somebody's watching this and you have, and there's a good article source in this, tag us. I'd be curious to go down that train a little bit and follow it. But what do kind of modern thinkers, I think you cite people like Wayne Grudem, Craig Blomberg, these are leading scholars who are conservative. How do they approach the story of Jonah and the whale?
Yes, I think each of them has a nuanced view of the story.
Mm.
And Wayne Grudem would remind us that the Bible is not meant to be a scientific textbook. It doesn't give us explicit scientific information, and yet it is reliable. The Bible doesn't deceive us. And Blumberg also has kind of is on the fence, as I understand his
Huh.
writings on this story. I think he might admit to the possibility that it could have happened, but he would say, as I understand his writings, that it's not necessarily historical because we can still derive moral and spiritual truth from the story, whatever
Mm.
you believe about its historicity. But we
That
might also ask what another scholar thought about it, and that's Jesus himself in the book of Matthew. He refers to the book of Jonah, and he relates it to his own death and resurrection.
mm.
Now, for the Christian, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is foundational to our belief, to our understanding of the world, to our understanding of God's plan of salvation. And if Jesus links that to the story of Jonah, uh, the story of Jesus is historic, and our faith comes to nothing if that wasn't true. For Jesus to link it to the story of Jonah, I think we should at least pause and consider the possibility that that also is history.
That's a great way to look at it. Now, I haven't thought about it through this lens, so I'm somewhat thinking out loud and would have to look at the text. But William Lane Craig has a distinction between kind of somebody who's referenced in scripture as a literary figure and someone who's referenced as a historical figure. So you could refer to somebody like Job, meaning the story of Job as an example we can learn from, not implying that Job is necessarily historical. But his point about Adam is that when Adam is referenced, he's referred not just as somebody who's a literary figure, but is referred specifically as somebody who is historical. And thus, a biblical worldview, because it comes from Jesus, requires that we think about Jesus as a historical figure. Sounds like that's some of the debate about Jonah. So Jesus could say, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, referring to the story, or is he referring to him in a way distinctly as a historical figure? I don't have to answer that right now. We don't have to nuance that, but that's where these debates would go. And maybe I'll do a follow-up on that if people want a nuance on it. In fact, I'd invite people watching this, go read the text carefully and look at it and see what you think. Uh, Anything else before we look at your approach to science and faith, like what's at stake with the question of scientifically analyzing Jonah? Or are you ready to keep rolling?
No, I agree with what you just said. An historic Adam and Eve and historic Jesus is unquestionably true. Whether Jonah is historical is of less significance. If he's not
Mm,
historical, our faith is intact. And I think
mm,
that's a very useful distinction.
mm. Fair enough. I love that. Good point. Okay. So I'm nuancing this because I'm a professor and a philosopher, and it's really important that we don't just jump in and go, what does the science show about Jonah the whale? Like, we're thinking about this. So you talked earlier about how you don't think science conflicts with faith, but there's a lot of people who take different approaches to science and faith. Some say science is against faith. Some say they're in different domains where they're asking totally different questions. Some say they're asking different questions but overlap sometimes. You have what's called a concordist approach to the intersection of science and faith, which lines up a lot of what we do at Talbot School of Theology in the MA Phil program and the Science and Religion program and in our apologetics program. Tell us what that is and the intersection between when we do scientific research and when we look at the Bible. What kind of concordance do you expect?
Well, that's sort of how I've understood things for a long time before I had heard the word concordance. I remember taking a history of science class as an undergraduate at Princeton, and my professor was ridiculing the history of Christianity and favoring science, and I asked the question, well, if 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 both are concerned with discovering the truth, shouldn't they, if properly understood, agree with each other? if we can understand both properly. And his response as a professor was he just laughed at me. Um,
Interesting.
so, but I think that some of the disagreements between theological interpretations and scientific interpretations of reality very often come down to either incomplete information or misinterpretation, either of the text
Mm.
or of the data. There's always an element of interpretation in putting things together. And as we acquire more knowledge, hopefully the the ideas will converge and come closer together rather than diverge.
Mm.
So that's what I would see as concordist view, that ultimately we should seek truth wherever we can find it. In the Reformation, there was the idea of the two books of nature. There's the book of creation, where we see God's work, his glory, his creativity, and then there's the special revelation in Scripture of his plan of salvation.
That's great. That's really helpful. It's important to say there's not like spiritual truth and then scientific truth. There's just, as Francis Schaeffer would say, true truth. But there are certain spiritual questions that don't intersect with science, like, say, the nature of, salvation by grace. That's not a scientific question. That's a theological question. And there's scientific questions that don't intersect in any direct way with science, like that water is H2O. But when we're talking about the same thing, for example, that the universe has a beginning, the Bible starts by saying in the beginning, and there's other passages in the Bible that imply the universe is not eternal. Now the Bible and theology is speaking to questions of science, and there should be an intersection if the Bible's true with science. So we're looking for areas where there's concordance between them when they speak about the same issues. That's for people watching. Now, let's jump into the question I've been waiting to ask you. At this point, some people are thinking, we've nuanced this to death, but I'm so curious. Are there legitimate, like modern examples of people who have survived in a whale? And what, if anything, would we learn from these?
Well, let me mention a few facts about the whales first, though, just to
Great.
frame our understanding. So, as I looked into what researchers have found in looking at fin whales, first of all, for Jonah to enter the mouth of the whale and survive, we would like to see a whale without teeth so that it doesn't get shredded in the process.
Yep.
And fin whales are among the species that have no teeth, so he can safely enter the mouth. Now, is there enough space for a human being to enter the mouth of a whale? The fin whale reaches up to 70 feet in length. I
Mm.
think 40 to 50 tons they weigh.
Whew.
And the mouth, when it's fully open, is the size of several door frames, so large enough to
Mm.
accommodate someone of any size. So he could enter. So where does he go from there to get into the belly? I've heard it pointed out that, well, there would have been gastric juices in the whale, right? That would have been caused Jonah's skin to disintegrate, and how could that have happened? The fin whale has three stomachs in succession. So the first stomach, the forestomach, has no gastric juices. You could safely be in there if there was enough air to breathe. If you go further along the digestive route, you're in for trouble reaching gastric juices. The problem is, how do you get into the stomach? You have to go through the esophagus first, right? And the esophagus of a fin whale is just 4 inches in diameter. So there's no way that Jonah, even if he were an expert contortionist, could slide through that narrow space.
Yeah.
So I think that he probably was not in the digestive system, assuming we're assuming that it's a real story.
Yeah.
Um, so what could the text mean by referring to the belly of the whale? So if you look at how the whale feeds, the fin whale will lunge forward in the water to bring in as much water as possible, its diet being small fish and krill, and it filters out that water. And that inrush of water actually doubles the size of the whale and expands the mouth downward. So the underside of the whale, or the belly, is
Mm.
actually mostly the mouth filled with water coming in. So we can hypothesize that Jonah would have been there in that space. So the next question is, would he have had enough air to breathe? Could
Yeah.
he have survived and not suffocated for 3 days and 3 nights? That's the most difficult part to answer scientifically, I think.
Mm.
There are two problems. You've got to have air to breathe, and you've got to be able to have oxygen to absorb, and you have to be able to liberate carbon dioxide. If you're not able to do those things, you will die within a short period of time. So my hypothesis, there's no way to scientifically prove this because we can't do an experiment going back and looking at Jonah and taking measurements. We have to use the information available to us. What's known about whales now that might fit? Um, and my idea is that perhaps this whale was in shallow water, or was directed by God to be in a shalloh area where it was not completely submerged. There was an ongoing pocket of air that Jonah could take advantage of. If I see the whale diving and coming back to the surface and taking in water and releasing water, there's really nothing firm for Jonah to hold on to in the mouth of this whale. It's going to be a slippery surface on all sides. And I think he would have been exhausted after 3 days and nights. Who could stay awake that long just to take a
Oh,
breath when necessary?
yeah.
So I think it had to have been fairly stationary, resting maybe in shallow water with an ongoing air pocket.
Hmm.
So your next question is, well, are there any examples of people surviving under similar circumstances? There are three cases that I would draw your
Okay,
attention
hang on.
to.
Let me jump in here before
Okay.
you go to those three cases. So, if I understand, your assessment is that if we have certain conditions, a certain kind of whale, it's in shallow water, not moving too much, it's not scientifically impossible. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes. Improbable, but not impossible.
Okay, so that's really helpful because part of the task here is not, we don't know exactly what whale it is. We're not given any of these conditions. Just simply say, is there a possible pathway there for which someone could survive 3 days in a whale? And you're saying if certain things line up, which according to the story, God was directing anyways, one could survive in a whale. Unlikely, but not impossible. Okay. Got it. And then you were saying there's three examples that don't perfectly mirror this, but tell us something about living in a whale today. Tell us those examples.
Well, first of all, for listeners, don't try this at home. Don't anyone try to stay underwater for 3 days. I don't recommend it. As a physician, I just have to say that.
Good
There
call.
was
Good qualifier.
there was a famous case in 1891, I think it was. James Bartley was a fisherman off the coast of the Falkland Islands, and it was widely reported that he was swallowed by a whale and survived. And this was picked up by a Christian apologist wishing to affirm a literal reading of Jonah. Unfortunately, it wasn't well investigated. It turned out to be a false story, a hoax.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah, so but it's out there all the way all over in the literature. And Ted
Mm,
Davis, a philosopher of science, historian of science, it thoroughly has documented this, and it's not a true story after all. But there are two recent cases not involving whales. Um, one one actually did. There was a lobster fisherman off the coast of Cape Cod who was diving, I assume free diving, and he was actually fully swallowed by a humpback whale, was entirely within the mouth of the whale.
gosh.
He reports that it was dark. He was fully enclosed, and the whale came back up and released him. He estimates within 30 seconds. Most people can hold their breath for 30 seconds. If you're terrified in the belly of a whale, maybe less time, but he survived that. And there are news articles out there documenting his story.
Hmm.
Even more interesting is a man, Harrison O'Keene, who was uh, trapped in a tugboat off the coast of Nigeria. The boat sunk and overturned, so he was trapped in this small room. And the way the boats were designed, the doors locked by default, so that if pirates were to capture the ship, they wouldn't be able to access all of the rooms. So once the boat was on the bottom of the ocean, he had no way to get out of the room, and he was in this small sort of a bathroom enclosure for 3 days before
Oh,
he was rescued. Yes,
3 days. Interesting.
and 3 days. You can
Hmm.
actually find videos of his rescue on the internet if anyone wants to look this up. So it's well documented that someone could live with a sufficiently large air pocket for 3 days. And I don't think he didn't look very healthy, I must say, at the end of that
Oh,
3 days.
yeah.
So there would be your brain wouldn't be functioning well with the accumulation of carbon dioxide and deprivation of oxygen. But still, he survived.
Mm,
So in principle, it's possible to survive under unique conditions for that long. So if Jonah had a large enough air pocket and was physically stable and not diving to the bottom of the ocean too often, it seems plausible, unlikely, but plausible that he could have
mm.
survived that.
That's
Still,
real.
God's hand is in the details, isn't he?
Mm. I think that's right. And it's just so interesting to think about the story and break it down and look at the details and think, if he did survive, he would not have been in very good shape, but he would have been likely sufficiently humbled, which was the point of the story, is that he needed to be humbled. And this is the kind of thing that would, scare you and humble you, especially with God's hand over this, which is a larger part of the purpose of the story. So maybe tell me, you went into this, you said your faith does not rest upon this. It was a paper you were doing at Talbot. What did this do to your faith, if anything? Was it just fun? Was it encouraging? Talked about now that you're looking back on this project. Again, you published it in the Christian Research Journal, which is a great contribution. How does this affect your faith, if at all?
I don't see my faith as having changed, but it was a lot of fun looking into the details. And and now when I read the story of Jonah, I have images from the study of whales that come to mind that
Mm.
enrich the story for me personally.
I love that. I'd actually encourage, there's certain new AI videos about Jonah and the whale. There's cartoons that put images in our mind, and those are fine for a place. I'd encourage people to use images of this whale and not say we know for sure that it is, but it kind of makes it more tangible and more real when you kind of look at it in the way you're describing it, not this mythical land, 2,800 years ago. But here's the kind of whale. Here's an example of somebody surviving. If I were teaching in this passage, this is kind of the very stuff I would use to make it come alive and humanize it for people. Last question. What do you think the takeaway is from your study? What's the take home for people who are listening to this or who read your article?
Oh, well, number one, science and faith need not be in conflict, and they can be hermeneutic allies one to another. I think we need to look for ways in which that's possible. The story tells us very powerfully that God is faithful to his promises, and he will accomplish his promises regardless of whatever obstacles may exist in our lives on earth. And he accomplishes his purposes in history and also in our individual lives.
Mm,
Now, in the story of Jonah, we see that even though Jonah was disobedient at first, God still accomplished his purposes through Jonah. So that causes me to ask the question, well, if God can accomplish so much through someone's disobedience, what would it mean for God to work through us as individuals who are obedient and
mm.
seeking to follow his instruction, his commandments? What would that look like in our lives? And that's an interesting question that any of us can ask. And as we try to align our own plans with God's purposes and be a part of what he's doing in the world.
Mm.
So these are wonderful ideas to pause and consider. And you don't actually have to come to a near drowning experience to be humbled. There are other ways that he gets our attention. But if anyone listening, if God is calling you and speaking to your heart, listen to him.
Mm.
Stop and listen, and don't let the doubts that some of the critics have put forward get in the way of you hearing his voice, because it's worth leaning into him and pursuing him and letting him pursue you. And that personal relationship with our God is what gives us the most meaning in life. My old friend Bart Ehrman has written, he doesn't think that the Bible says that we're to have a personal relationship with God. I'm not a scriptural authority, but I think he's very much mistaken on that point. I think there are plenty of places in Scripture where people do interact with God personally, and Jesus seeks a personal relationship with us, and it can be so meaningful.
Well, John chapter 17, in his final prayer, this is eternal life, that they may know you. And that's not experiential knowledge like riding a bike. That's not intellectual knowledge like knowing something in math or history. That's relational knowledge, that we are invited into relationship with our Creator, I think is really, really powerful. By the way, I would encourage people not to wait for a voice calling you somewhere like Jonah. I mean, that was an audible voice, a unique prophet during a certain covenant, during a certain time. God has made his will known, and he is speaking through the scriptures today. So pick up, read the story of Jonah, and then maybe go read one of the Gospels, because Jesus, they asked him for a sign. And although he did miracles, the primary sign he was going to give was the sign of Jonah, 3 days and 3 days and nights, not in the belly of the whale, but in the earth. And on the third day, he would rise again. We got a lot of videos here. There's a lot of books on the resurrection of Jesus. That's in part why the story of Jonah is so important, is that it's the primary pointer towards the miracle Jesus did that reveals his identity. Dr. Cheshire, I think this is such a wonderful example. You weren't intimidated to look at this scientifically. You didn't come with a preconceived response and thought, you know what? I'm going to look at this, see if it's true, see if it's possible, and I hope you'll do a study. My only study on lions and bears in Israel is what my Jewish host told me. I haven't looked any further. But I think this is a model for a lot of people who love the scriptures, interested in science, say, let's probe in and see if there's a concordance between the two without fear, with the willingness to follow the science wherever it leads. And in this case, I think it adds to our understanding of the story of Jonah and certainly removes the claim that science disproves it and it's scientifically impossible. So kudos to you for doing this. Thanks for joining us. I know you don't do a ton of interviews because you're a professor and you're a medical doctor. You're a busy guy, but really appreciate you coming on. We're going to link to the article below. A lot of the points you made here and even further, people can read that and they can study it. And folks, by the way, we have a master's program in science and religion or in apologetics. We would love to have you come study alongside stellar students like Dr. Cheshire, by the way. We have some amazing students in our program. Information is below. It's fully distance program. We also, this would be interesting for you to know, Bill, is that we just updated our certificate program. For those not ready for a master's, we have new lectures, new content. It's dynamic, and we'll walk you through how to learn apologetics and get a certificate from Talbot. There's a 25% discount below specifically for those who watch. Make sure you hit subscribe. Many of you who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed and you haven't hit that notification button. We got a lot more conversations like this coming up. Dr. Cheshire, this was a lot of fun. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thanks for writing a great article. Thanks for reading our program, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.